A veteran's quiet kindness sparks hope in a broken town, but betrayal looms. Will his heart endure? Like, subscribe, hit the bell. Stories that grip your soul. The morning air bit at Frank's knuckles as he locked the door of his one-bedroom apartment in Willow Creek, a small town where the main street hadn't changed since the 60s. At 68, Frank moved with the deliberate pace of a man who'd carried too much for too long. His faded green army jacket, patched at the elbows, hung loose on his wiry frame. Grey hair peeked from under a worn baseball cap, and his blue eyes, though tired, held a flicker of stubborn hope. Every dawn, he walked the 3 blocks to Millie's diner, toolbox in hand, the metal tools clanking softly against the rhythm of his boots on cracked pavement. The air smelled of damp leaves and distant wood smoke, the kind of scent that clung to a place forgotten by time. Frank had been the diner's handyman for 7 years, fixing wobbly tables, leaky faucets, and flickering lights for barely above minimum wage. It wasn't much, but it kept the lights on and the memories at bay. Vietnam had taken his youth, the VA system his patience, and a divorce his trust. But Frank hadn't let it snuff out the part of him that still believed in doing right. He'd seen too many men lose that spark, and he'd be damned if he joined them. "Good morning, Millie," he called, stepping into the diner at 5:30 sharp, the bell above the door jingling. The scent of brewing coffee and sizzling bacon greeted him, wrapping around the chipped Formica counters and red vinyl booths like a warm blanket. Millie, 62 and tough as nails, barely looked up from her ledger. "Fix that squeaky door today, Frank, or I'm docking your coffee ration," she teased, her voice gravelly from years of shouting orders. Frank chuckled, the sound low and weathered, and set to work. He was a man of routine, finding comfort in the familiar, tightening screws, oiling hinges, wiping down surfaces until they gleamed. But beneath the steady hands, there was a quiet ache, a sense that life had dealt him a hand he hadn't deserved. Still, he showed up every damn day. By 6, the early crowd trickled in, truckers, farmers, and retirees, their voices a steady hum over the clink of forks and plates. Frank was tightening a loose booth screw when the bell chimed, sharper than usual, cutting through the morning chatter. He glanced up, and there, hesitating in the doorway, stood a boy, no older than 12, with messy brown hair and a face pale as winter. The kid wore a threadbare blue hoodie, sleeves too short, and sneakers with soles peeling at the edges. He clutched a tattered notebook to his chest like it was the only thing keeping him upright. His eyes, wide and wary, darted around the diner before settling on the floor. Frank's gut twisted. He'd seen that look before. On soldiers too young for the jungle, on kids in the VA waiting rooms, waiting for someone who never showed. The boy shuffled to the farthest booth, sliding in with his back to the wall, notebook still hugged tight. Frank didn't stare, didn't make a fuss. Instead, he grabbed a clean mug from the counter, filled it with coffee, black, the way he knew the kid wouldn't expect, and walked over. "Cold out there," Frank said softly, setting the mug down. "On the house. Growing boys need something warm." The boy's eyes flicked up, just for a second, meeting Frank's. No words, just a tiny nod, but it was enough. Frank turned back to his toolbox, pretending not to notice the kid's trembling hands as he wrapped them around the mug. It was a small thing, a cup of coffee. But Frank knew small things could mean the world when you had nothing else. Over the next week, the boy became part of the diner's rhythm. Every morning, 7 sharp, he'd slip in, always in that same blue hoodie, always with that notebook. He'd order the cheapest thing on the menu, an egg on toast, $2 flat, and count out his change with painful precision, quarters and dimes spread across the table. Sometimes he came up short, and Frank, without a word, would cover the difference from his own pocket. "Keep the change," he'd muttered to Millie, who raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. Frank didn't ask questions, didn't pry. He noticed the kid's sneakers were held together with duct tape, noticed the way he flinched when the bell chimed too loud. Once, when the boy thought no one was looking, he opened his notebook, revealing pages filled with careful pencil sketches. Soldiers, tanks, a flag rippling in the wind. Frank caught a glimpse and felt a pang in his chest. He'd drawn like that once, back in 68, before the jungle taught him to stop dreaming. One morning, as Frank refilled the kid's coffee, he leaned in slightly. "Nice drawings," he said, voice low. "Reminds me of my old sketchbook." The boy froze, then slowly closed the notebook, but his shoulders relaxed just a fraction. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Frank didn't push, just nodded and moved on, leaving the kid to his silence. He knew trust wasn't given, it was earned, one quiet moment at a time. The boy's visits became Frank's anchor, a quiet rhythm in the grind of Willow Creek's mornings. Each day at 7, the bell would chime, and there he'd be, slipping into the corner booth, his tattered notebook a constant companion. Frank started keeping an eye out, saving the warmest mug of coffee, sneaking an extra slice of toast when Millie wasn't looking. The kid never said much, but his eyes, wary, grey like storm clouds, started to soften. One morning, Frank noticed a new sketch in the notebook, left open by accident. A soldier saluting under a willow tree. The lines were shaky but deliberate, full of a kid's heart. Frank didn't comment, just slid a fresh coffee over and said, "Looks like you've got a story in those drawings." The boy's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but close. It was enough to keep Frank going, enough to make the ache in his bones feel lighter. He started to wonder about the kid, where he came from, why he was always alone. The hoodie was thinner each day, the duct tape on his sneakers spreading like a losing battle. Once, Frank saw him pause outside, checking over his shoulder before entering, like he was afraid of being followed. Frank's old instincts kicked in, the ones honed in jungles and VA waiting rooms. This kid wasn't just shy, he was carrying something heavy. But Frank respected the silence, knowing some wounds only bled when you poked them. Instead, he offered what he could, a warm seat, a kind word, a second chance at breakfast when the coins didn't add up. The diner's regulars started to notice. Old man Jenkins, a Korean War vet with a limp and a loud laugh, gave Frank a nod one morning. "Good on you, Frank. Kid looks like he needs a friend." Sally, the part-time waitress with pink hair and a smoker's cough, wasn't so sure. "Here's trouble. Mark my words," she muttered, wiping down the counter. "Kids like that don't just wander in for eggs. You're asking for a headache." Frank shrugged, tightening a faucet under the sink. "Kids gotta eat, Sally. Ain't complicated." But whispers spread as they do in small towns. At the barber shop, Ed, who'd never served but loved his flag bumper stickers, scoffed. "Frank's playing hero again. Ought to leave strays to social services." Others, like Mrs. Carter, the librarian who brought her crosswords to the diner, saw it differently. "That man's got a heart bigger than this town," she said, peering over her glasses. "Shame more folks don't." Frank heard the chatter but kept his head down, focusing on the squeaky hinges and sticky salt shakers. He wasn't out to prove anything, but the skepticism stung like sand in an old wound. He'd felt it before, when he came back from Vietnam to protests instead of parades, when the VA lost his paperwork twice, when his ex-wife called him a dreamer who'd never change the world. Maybe they were right, but he'd be damned if he'd stop trying. One afternoon, Sally cornered him by the coffee machine, her voice low. "I saw that kid pocket a sugar packet, Frank. You're enabling a thief." Frank's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone even. "Sugar packet ain't worth a fight, Sal. Let it go." She rolled her eyes and walked off. But the accusation lingered, heavy as the toolbox he carried home. Trouble came on a crisp Tuesday, when the air smelled of frost and burnt toast. Frank was scrubbing a stubborn stain off a booth when Millie stormed out of her office, her face like thunder. "Frank!" she barked, loud enough to hush the diner. "You been covering that kid's tab again?" The regulars froze, forks midair. Frank stood, wiping his hands on his jeans, his heart sinking. "Just $1 or $2, Millie. Kid's short sometimes." Her eyes narrowed, arms crossed over her stained apron. $1 or $2 adds up. This ain't a charity, and you ain't his daddy." The boy, tucked in his booth, shrank lower, his notebook clutched like a shield. Frank stepped closer to Millie, lowering his voice. "He's just a kid, Millie. Ain't right to let him go hungry." She didn't budge. "Rules are rules. You keep this up, it's coming out of your pay, or worse." The threat hung heavy, sharper than the cold outside. Frank's job was all he had. Rent was late, his truck needed tires, and the VA wasn't exactly sending bonus checks. He glanced at the boy, whose eyes were fixed on the table, shoulders curled inward. Frank's chest tightened. He could stop, let the kid fend for himself. It'd be easier. Safer. But the thought made his stomach churn, like betraying a promise he'd made long ago. "I hear you, Millie," he said finally, voice steady. "But I'm paying his tab today, full price." Millie huffed, but waved him off, muttering about bleeding hearts. Frank slipped a crumpled $5 from his wallet and rang it up himself, ignoring the stares. The boy ate in silence, but when he left, he looked at Frank for a split second longer than usual. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The victory was short-lived. By noon, a new sign appeared behind the counter, printed in Millie's blocky handwriting. No free meals. All tabs must be paid in full. Staff violations, so wage deduction. Sally smirked, snapping a photo with her phone. Guess your little project's done, Frank, she said, loud enough for the lunch crowd to hear. The words cut deeper than they should have. Frank kept working, but the diner felt colder, the hum of conversation sharper. That afternoon, Ed from the barbershop stopped by, leaning over the counter with a grin. Heard you're bankrolling some runaway, Frank. Hope you got a lawyer on speed dial. The regulars chuckled, but Mrs. Carter shot at a glare. Leave him be, Ed. World needs more like Frank, not less. Frank stayed quiet, scrubbing a coffee pot until his knuckles ached. But doubt crept in, heavy and unwelcome. Was he making a difference, or just digging his own grave? The kid's sketches flashed in his mind, that soldier under the willow, proud and alone. Frank knew that feeling, knew it too well. He'd lost buddies in Nam, lost his marriage, lost faith in the system that promised to take care of its own. But he hadn't lost himself, not yet. That night, as he locked up, the diner's neon sign buzzed faintly, casting a red glow on the empty street. Frank made a choice. He'd keep paying the kid's tab, keep showing up no matter what Millie or the town thought. Because some fights were worth losing everything for. The weight of Millie's sign pressed on Frank like a bruise that wouldn't fade. Each morning, he slipped into the diner at dawn, the air thick with grease and tension, and felt the eyes of the regulars boring into him. He kept his routine, fixing a flickering bulb, tightening a loose chair, but his hands trembled more than usual, betraying the storm inside. The boy still came, 7 sharp, his threadbare blue hoodie a quiet rebellion against the cold. Frank paid his tab without a word, sliding crumpled bills to Millie before she could complain. But the kid's silence felt heavier now, his sketches hidden, his eyes darting to the door like he sensed the walls closing in. Frank wanted to say something, to ask if he was okay, but the words stuck in his throat. He'd learned long ago that some pain didn't need a voice. It showed in the slump of shoulders, the grip on a tattered notebook. One morning, as Frank cleared a nearby table, he noticed the boy had left his notebook open. A new sketch. A soldier kneeling, head bowed, beside a gravestone. Frank's breath caught. He'd knelt like that too at too many graves for buddies who never made it home. He didn't mention it, just set a fresh coffee down and moved on. But the image burned into him. A reminder of why he couldn't quit. Not now. Not ever. But the cost was mounting. His paycheck was thinner, his truck's gas gauge hovered on empty, and the VA's latest letter about processing delays mocked him from his kitchen counter. Still, he showed up because giving up on the kid felt like giving up on himself. Then came the morning when everything cracked. It was a grey, drizzly Wednesday, the kind that made Willow Creek feel like it was drowning in its own regrets. Frank was patching a hole in the diner's wall when Millie's voice cut through the hum of breakfast chatter. Frank, my office, now! The regulars went quiet, their eyes flicking between curiosity and pity. Frank set down his hammer, wiping his hands on his faded green army jacket, and followed her. The office was a cramped cave of papers and cigarette smoke, the air stale with Millie's anger. She shoved a payroll sheet at him, her finger jabbing at the numbers. You're shorting me, Frank. Covering that kid's meals is stealing from my books. Frank's jaw clenched, his voice low but firm. I pay his tab, Millie, every cent. You know that. Her eyes narrowed, venom in her tone. Don't play saint with me, I checked the receipts. You're fudging the numbers, and I'm done looking the other way. The accusation hit like a punch. Frank had never stolen a dime. Not in his 68 years, not even when he was hungry. I'm no thief, he said, his voice shaking with a rage he hadn't felt since the war. You want to fire me? Do it, but don't call me a liar. Millie leaned back, smirking. Oh, I'm not firing you. Yet. But one more slip and you're out. And I'm docking your pay for this week. Frank's fists balled, the scars on his knuckles whitening. He wanted to fight, to tell her about the kid's sketches, the fear in his eyes, the way he reminded Frank of every soldier left behind. But he swallowed it, nodded, and walked out, the door slamming behind him. The diner was silent, the regulars staring. Sally whispered to a trucker, loud enough for Frank to hear. Told you you'd get burned playing hero? Frank grabbed his toolbox and kept working, but his chest felt like it was caving in. Had he been wrong? Was this all for nothing? The next morning, the bell didn't chime at 7. Frank glanced at the door, expecting the boy's hunched figure, but the booth stayed empty. By 7:30, his stomach knotted with worry. He stepped outside, scanning the foggy street, the air sharp with wet asphalt and pine. No blue hoodie, no tattered notebook. The diner's warmth felt hollow without him. Frank tried to focus, tightening a faucet, but his mind raced. Had Millie's outburst scared the kid off? Was he sick, hurt, or, God forbid, something worse? The sketches haunted him. That soldier, that gravestone. Frank knew what it was to carry ghosts, to feel like the world had turned its back. He checked the door again at 8, then 8:15, each minute heavier than the last. Sally noticed, smirking as she poured coffee. "Your stray finally ran off, huh? Told you it'd end bad." Frank ignored her, but the words sank deep, mingling with the ache of old betrayals. Comrades lost, promises broken, a country that forgot its own. By noon, he couldn't stand it. He slipped out during a lull, walking the block where he'd seen the boy disappear before. The street was quiet, just a stray cat and a rusted bike chained to a pole. No sign of him. Frank's heart thudded, a mix of fear and guilt. He'd failed before. Failed to save his squad. Failed to hold his marriage. Failed to make the system care. He couldn't fail this kid too. The town's judgment grew louder. That afternoon, Ed from the barbershop swaggered into the diner, his voice carrying over the lunch rush. "Heard Frank's kid got picked up by the cops. Probably a runaway, and Frank's out here playing Robin Hood." The lies spread like wildfire. By evening, the regulars were buzzing, some with concern, others with scorn. Mrs. Carter tried to defend him, her voice sharp. "You all don't know a thing about that boy or Frank. Shame on you for gossiping." But the damage was done. Sally posted the payroll dispute in the town's group chat with a caption, "Frank's charity screwing us all." Laughing emojis piled up, each one a knife in Frank's back. He overheard a farmer mutter, "Vet or not, he's got to know his place." The word stung, echoing the jeers he'd faced coming home from NAM, the VA's endless red tape, the ex-wife who'd called him a fool for believing in honour. Frank kept working, but his hands shook, his eyes burned. That night, alone in his apartment, he sat on the sagging couch, staring at the wall. The silence was deafening, broken only by the drip of a leaky faucet. He felt like he was back in 688, waiting for a chopper that never came, surrounded by men who'd trusted him to bring them home. He hadn't, and now he'd lost the kid too. Frank's throat tightened, his vision blurred. "Damn it!" he shouted, slamming his fist on the coffee table, the sound echoing in the empty room. He buried his face in his hands, the weight of every loss crashing down. Buddies, love, hope. Was this what kindness got you? A docked paycheck and a town that spat in your face? Then his eyes fell on a small wooden box on the shelf, dusty from years of neglect. He opened it, hands trembling, and pulled out a faded photograph. Him and his squad, grinning in 67 before the jungle took half of them. Tucked beside it was a bronze star, its ribbon frayed but proud. He'd earned it for dragging a wounded buddy to safety under fire, even when the odds said they'd both die. Frank traced the medal, remembering the kid's sketches, the soldier under the willow. He'd fought for men who couldn't fight for themselves, and he'd do it again. Not for glory, not for thanks, but because it was right. The boy wasn't just a stray. He was a reminder of why Frank had survived, why he still showed up. He set the medal down, his resolve hardening like steel. He'd find the kid, or at least make sure he was safe, no matter what the town thought, no matter what it cost, because some battles were worth fighting, even if you fought alone. The next morning, Frank woke before dawn, his resolve a quiet fire in his chest. He pulled on his faded green army jacket, the weight of the bronze star still heavy in his mind, and headed to Millie's diner. The air was sharp with frost, the streets of Willow Creek silent except for the crunch of his boots on gravel. He didn't expect the boy to show, not after yesterday's absence, but he'd be there, just in case. At 6, as he oiled the squeaky door, the bell chimed, too early for the regulars. Frank turned, heart lurching, but it wasn't the boy. A woman, mid-40s, with tired eyes and a navy coat, stepped inside, her posture rigid. Behind her, a man in a crisp suit, badge glinting on his belt, scanned the diner like he owned it. The woman's gaze locked on Frank, and something in her expression, grief, gratitude, guilt, made his stomach twist. "You're Frank, aren't you?" she said, her voice soft but steady. He nodded, setting down his tools, bracing for whatever came next. "I'm Sarah, Tommy's aunt." Tommy, the name hit like a bullet. The boy had a name. Sarah's eyes glistened, but she held herself together. "He's been coming here, hasn't he, for breakfast?" Frank swallowed, his throat tight. "Yeah, every morning till yesterday." The man in the suit stepped forward, his voice clipped. "Sheriff Daniels, we've got Tommy in protective custody. Ran away from a foster home last month." Frank's heart sank, but Sarah raised a hand, silencing the sheriff. "Tommy's dad was my brother," she said, her voice cracking. "Marine, killed in Iraq 3 years ago. Tommy's mom, she didn't cope, lost him to the system. I've been fighting to get him back." She pulled a folded paper from her coat, her hands trembling. "He left this at the foster home. It's why I'm here." Frank took the paper, unfolding it carefully. It was one of Tommy's sketches, a soldier under a willow, with words scrawled in pencil. "The man at the diner sees me, he's like Dad." Frank's vision blurred, his chest tight with a mix of pride and pain. He'd been right to keep going, but the truth about Tommy's life cut deep. A kid, alone, carrying his father's ghost, just like Frank had carried his squad's. Sarah's voice softened. "You gave him a safe place, Frank. He hasn't spoken much since his dad died, but he talked about you." Frank looked away, his jaw tight. "Just gave him coffee and toast. Ain't much." "It's everything," Sarah said, tears spilling now. He felt seen. The diner's door chimed again, and there was Tommy, in his threadbare blue hoodie, escorted by a social worker. His eyes found Frank's, and for the first time, he didn't look away. Frank knelt, ignoring the ache in his knees, and met the boy's gaze. "You okay, kid?" he asked, voice rough. Tommy nodded. Then, in a whisper so quiet it barely carried, said, "Thanks for the coffee." It was the first time he'd spoken to Frank, and it landed like a gift. Sarah knelt beside them, pulling Tommy into a hug. "I'm taking him home," she told Frank. "Court's finally giving me custody, thanks to his note. It showed he's got someone who cares." Frank stood, his throat too tight to speak. The sheriff cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. "Heard about your trouble here, Frank. Millie's accusations don't hold water. We checked the books." Frank's eyes widened, but before he could respond, the diner's door swung open and Millie stormed in, her face red. "What's this about my books?" she snapped. The sheriff's gaze hardened. "Your staff's been talking, Millie. Seems you've been docking pay without cause. We'll be looking into it." Millie paled, stammering, but the regulars, now trickling in, were watching. Sally, lingering by the counter, looked away, her smirk gone. Ed from the barber shop, who'd spread the runaway rumour, shifted uncomfortably in his booth. Mrs. Carter, crossword in hand, gave Frank a proud nod. The tide was turning, and Frank felt it, a quiet justice settling over the diner's worn booths. Sarah handed Frank a small envelope. "Tommy wanted you to have this," she said, then led the boy out, promising to visit. Frank opened it later, alone at the counter. Inside was a new sketch. Frank, in his army jacket, standing tall, with Tommy beside him, both under a willow tree. Below, in Tommy's shaky handwriting, "You're my hero." Frank's eyes burned, but he smiled, tucking the sketch into his pocket, close to his heart. Willow Creek didn't change overnight, but Frank's stand rippled through it. The next week, Mrs. Carter started a pay-it-forward board at the diner, where folks could cover meals for those in need. The first note pinned up read, "For a kid like Tommy." Regulars started tipping Frank extra, slipping bills into his toolbox with quiet nods. Even Sally softened, muttering an apology one morning, her eyes on the floor. Millie, under pressure from the sheriff's investigation, scrapped her no free meals sign and offered Frank a raise. He turned it down, his voice calm but firm. "Don't need your money, Millie, just need you to do right." She didn't argue. Frank kept working, but he added a new routine. Every Sunday, he volunteered at the community centre, teaching kids to draw, telling them stories of soldiers who never gave up. The kids listened, wide-eyed, and Frank saw Tommy in their faces, a reminder that small acts could plant seeds. Sarah brought Tommy by once a month, and the boy, slowly emerging from his shell, would sit with Frank, sketching in silence. One day, he drew a flag, proud and rippling, and gave it to Frank with a shy smile. The diner became a warmer place, its chipped counters and creaky booths a testament to what kindness could build. Frank's story spread quietly. First in Willow Creek, then beyond, when a local paper ran a piece. "Veterans' kindness saves a child, shames a town." Frank didn't read it, but Mrs. Carter framed it behind the counter, right beside Tommy's sketch. Months later, on a crisp spring morning, Frank walked to the diner, his toolbox lighter in his hand. The air smelled of blooming willows, the town waking under a soft pink sky. He paused at the diner's door, touching the sketch in his pocket, and thought of Tommy, safe with Sarah, drawing his way through grief. He thought of his squad, of the Bronze Star, of the battles he'd fought, some with guns, some with coffee mugs. Kindness wasn't loud, but it was fierce. And Frank had proven it could outlast betrayal, doubt, and time. He stepped inside, the bell chiming, and Millie called out, "Good morning, Frank." He smiled, the ache in his chest softer now, and got to work. Because heroes don't fade. They show up, one quiet act at a time. What moved you most? Drop it in the comments, hit that like, subscribe, and ring the bell. These stories deserve to be heard.